Hey, is this thing on? Hey guys, welcome to yet another fun topic in PowerApps. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about input forms. Now, you run into this often if you're doing any sort of data gathering within your app, where you've got to collect something and then submit it. So the first thing that you want to do is you really want to validate and scrub the data. You want to make sure that the information that's going to your data source is accurate and it's not going to throw some sort of error, because the last thing you want to do is have some error from your data source pop up in your app itself. There's not a lot of error handling that you can do, so you want to kind of avoid them before they get there. So there's a couple different tricks that we're going to discuss, and we're going to start out, we're going to talk about edit forms, which are built in, and those give you the opportunity to do a lot of those different types of controls. And then we're going to branch off into the second part and talk about custom forms. And this is that situation where you've got a form and it just doesn't kind of meet your needs and you need to just do it yourself. So you end up putting lots of controls out on the screen, and now you run into that, well, now how do I validate all this stuff before I hit a submit button? So we're going to talk about that. Let's get into it. Okay, let's set the stage here. In our first part, we've got a SharePoint list, and it's a pretty basic list, and I'll be honest, not a lot of thought put into all the different columns that are in here. These were just some different things to throw in so that we could start working with it from within our Power App. So a couple things we've got a title, which is pretty standard. We've got a cost center, which is a multiple choice column. We've got some comments, which is just multiple lines of text. Status, again, a choice. An approver name, which is a person or group. We've got a date submitted, date and time, start date, end date, and of course the usual modified, created by, modified by, which come free for the ride with any SharePoint list. So anyway, you'll notice over on the right hand side here that we've got a few of these that are marked as required. So this is very important, because as we start to get into our submission of information to this SharePoint list, we need to make sure we have a title, approver name, a date submitted, a start date, and an end date. They all have to be there. If any of those are not there, then we're going to run into a situation where SharePoint is going to throw a rod and say, whoop, you can't do that, we've got an error. And you'll get a nasty error message within PowerApps, which you can't really get away from. So let's talk a little bit more now about how we're going to get this over into our Power App itself. Okay, so here we are looking at our app. Now we're in play mode at this point, and I've skipped past a lot of the whole putting everything together. Pretty basic stuff. We put an edit form on our app screen, and we put a gallery on there. We set the gallery to be to our expenses list in SharePoint, and we've set the data source for our edit form to be the expenses list as well from SharePoint. So pretty basic stuff, not a lot going on there. But I wanted to start from this point. I wanted to start from the end so you sort of get an idea of where we're going with this. And in this particular example, we've got our list of entries over here, and our edit form is showing us what we currently have. We also have a submit button down here, which is used to submit that in. Now you notice we have asterisks next to all of the fields that were required as we had them listed within SharePoint in our list definition. So we had those as required, and they show up in here as required. There's some things that we can do about that to even go beyond the requirements. And there's also things that we can do even when SharePoint doesn't require things. We're going to explore that a little bit. One of the nice things that you get with an edit form is you get some properties that come along with it that tell us the state of the form. So in this particular case, our form here has a valid property, and the valid property will be either true or false if the form is valid. So all of our required fields have been filled in, so this form is actually valid. So the state of this would be true. Now I just have a label down here that just gives us a little bit nicer view of this rather than true or false, and it just says this form is valid. So this is true. We also get an unsaved property. Unsaved is great because unsaved gives us the opportunity to determine, has anybody made a change in this form, or is this the original record that we're looking at? It too is also a true or false property. So we can look at that, and we do in this particular label, and we say this form is saved, meaning there are no changes in it at this point in time. So if we come along here and put, let's just say, an X in this comments, you'll see that the form goes to being unsaved. So this became true. Form is unsaved. So we can use these types of things to try to limit the errors that we might get from SharePoint. Because if we simply did a submit when there were fields that were required, then we would get an error message. And so we need to kind of check those things from happening. Now, one of the tricks that you want to do in PowerApps is to try to make your form as user-friendly as possible. Now I know a lot of you come from the developer world, and in the developer world you used to put in the submit there that you would go through a whole bunch of stuff to make sure the data's good, make sure your fields were good, and if they weren't, you'd throw up a big error message on the screen and say, whoa, you can't do this, go back and fix it. So that doesn't work too well in the app world, and people are smart enough at this point in time that they know that things that have asterisks next to them are things that are required. Maybe not so much from just submitting the form, but maybe we can take the approach of keeping them from submitting without filling in the appropriate information. So let's go over here and we're going to start out, we're going to create a new entry. So I'm going to click on the plus. Now I've already tied this to creating a new form, and for those who are familiar with forms, you know that I just did a new form and then this particular form name, and that's pretty straightforward to make happen. So we can see that we actually have the ability down here to do a submit at this point in time. This would not be a good thing, because if we did a submit, we would be missing information, and boom, luckily our input form, our edit form, will go through and give us lots of error messages and things like that to let us know that we can't do that. So let's reset this and start to look at this from a different perspective. So one of the things that we might want to do is to restrict someone from doing all that. I mean, that was fine. Our edit form actually brought us all of those error messages, and we can work with those and we can customize those and we can make all that look pretty good. But even so, a lot of that kind of stuff, you might want to just avoid it. And how you can avoid it is pretty straightforward. So let's go over here and we'll go ahead and add one in. What I want to do is, I don't want anyone to be able to click the submit button until it is valid. So what we can do is we can come out of here. Let's go into our submit button, and we can come up here and we can see that we can go into the display mode, change the display mode, and we see it's always in edit mode. So let's just change that. We'll put a little if statement in there, and we'll say if Form1.Valid, then we're going to do edit. If not, then we're going to do disabled. Notice immediately we see that our button becomes disabled. So let's go ahead and see what we got now. Oh, there we go. We can't click on the submit. No submit. But if we fill in some information, we'll say this is a second entry, and we can leave the other fields alone because they're not required at this point in time. And we'll say we've got to put in a approver name. We'll put in Ann here, and we'll say this is for the 17th, so we'll give it an actual date. We'll give it a start date, let's say the 18th, and end date we'll say is the 20th. Alright, boom, just like that our form became valid, and our submit button is now lit up. That means, to us as a designer, that means that this information that's going to go to SharePoint is going to be accurate, and we're not going to get an error message if we click submit. So let's go ahead and click submit. We do that, and like magic, here is our second entry over here in our gallery. So it happened just that easily. Now, the other thing that you might want to do is you might want to look at the situation and say, well, you know, all we did in our gallery over here was just select a different entry, and we have a submit. I don't want to submit it. There's nothing to submit. Why confuse my people with a submit? So we can use that unsaved property. Let's go in here and do our submit again. And we can say if form 1 is valid, then we should be in edit mode. But we also want to say and form1.Unsaved. So that means that we have to have both of these conditions met. It has to be valid and it has to be unsaved in order for us to be in edit mode, for this control to be something that we can click on. So let's run this again, and we take a look, and we see now as we go through the gallery, we don't get that submit button. So we're not going to confuse our people with what do I do now? Do I submit this thing or what? So let's just go in here now and put in a change. Again, we're just going to put in an X in that comments, and you notice our form was now noted as unsaved, so our submit button became available. So we can submit that, and it is all submitted. Maybe a little bit more memorable to see if we put in here just a second entry. That way you'll see over in the gallery that it actually changes when we do that. So there we go, our second entry. You'll also notice, by the way, that as we came back to this, that we had a cost center and a status filled in. That's because, forgot to mention, but in our expense list, we do have a default listed in there, and so those came along for the ride in this case. Not important. But anyhow, so there's how we got to this point with this validation. Now, one of the things that you run into in some situations is you say, well, okay, I want to make sure that people put in comments. They need to put in a comment. So how do I do that? Well, you could go back to your SharePoint list and you could make it required, but maybe that breaks something else. Maybe you're using your list someplace else. So one of the things you can do in your app is come in here and look at your input form, your edit form, and you come over here and you see comments. Now the first thing that we want to do in here, if we look at our properties, is we want to actually make this editable. I've already done that, so let me do it on one that's not so you can see. And how you do that is you come into that data card and you go over into the advanced and you say, I want to unlock to change properties, because all of these properties are all disabled. You can't change them. So we come back here to comment. I've already done that, and you see I have this required here. So what I want to do is I want to change that. Instead of false, I want to change that to true. And so now we have true in there. So notice immediately that we have this asterisk next to it. So now that we know it is required. Okay, so let's go back in here again, and let's create a new entry, and we'll say a third entry, and we'll leave comments empty for right now. And we'll put in an approver, we'll put in Ann again, and we'll say our date here is the 17th, and our start date is the 18th, and our end date is the 19th. We're just making stuff up. We can't submit. We don't have the option to submit here because we haven't filled in this comments, because comments is now required. Not required in SharePoint, but required in our app. So we can go ahead and put in a comment in here, and now we have the ability to submit. So we go ahead and say, let's submit that, and now we have it, and there it is. Everything is all the way that we expected it to be. So that's a real simple way to do required field validation within an edit form. Most of the stuff is already built in. You can just take advantage of it, and you can customize. Again, most cases you want to try to customize your submitting. So that you don't submit information to your data source that you don't want to end up there. Okay, so in the first part, we looked at some of the built-in edit form capabilities. A lot of features and functionality that comes along with the ride for that, and it's a great place to start if it works for you. If you need something that's a little bit more flexible and you're willing to do your own input forms, you can do that. And so in this section, we're going to go ahead and take a look at building your own custom input form. So what we're looking at here is we've got two sort of different setups and two scenarios that we're going to go through. And as we mentioned in the first part, one of the things that you want to kind of break away from is that developer mode of getting the user to put in all their information and whatever they put in, and then they hit the submit button, and then you go through and try to do this test, that test, the other test, and then throw up a big error message that says you can't do this, or this is wrong, or that's whatever. You know, in general, users have learned to click OK and ignore messages, and then they get confused and don't know what to do. But you have the opportunity with an app to be a little bit more user-friendly, and this is what you see in apps. You know, people don't need manuals to learn to figure out how to use an app. They download an app and they get started with it, and they usually figure it out pretty quickly. So take that to advantage in your app, that you can kind of work off of that to some degree. So in this first example here on the left-hand side, we see that we have this restricting the submit based on conditions. So what this is saying is that we've got some input. In this case, we've got 5 different input fields, and we've annotated with the asterisk that these are required. So that's the first indication that something needs to be put in there. As a user looks at this, they're going to see that first of all, they've got hints here that they know they need to enter some value, and they immediately look down and see the submit, and they say, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and submit. Oh, I can't submit. Well, let's see. I got to put something in here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead up here, and I'll something is here. So I've put in that, and then they look down, and they're like, well, I can't submit. They pretty quickly learn that they need to fill in these ones that have the red asterisks next to them. So we'll put more here, and we'll say some more here, and we'll go down and we'll say more here. And immediately we have the opportunity to do a submit. So we didn't have that before, and we know that we can now do it because we have valid data that we can go ahead and put through. So that's one way to restrict the submit based on that. The other one is shown over here on the right hand side. So this is where we want to do kind of a one-shot, meaning that our submit button is available, but we want to go ahead and give some feedback to the user should they be just jumping the gun and saying, I'm just going to go ahead and submit. So in this case, we get one shot to do it, and you can customize this all to your own. I just sort of work with a one-shot example, meaning that you can go ahead and fill stuff in. You can hit the submit button one time, and then after that, you're in that restricted mode where you can't do anything until you fill it in. So we'll see here if we hit submit, we notice, okay, we've got all these things that came up with red around them. So we can immediately see that we need to please correct the highlighted fields. So that's one way to also give some feedback, and immediately we know exactly what we need to fill in. And of course we can go through and fill it in. We'll put some general stuff here. I'll just be random about it, and we can see that our submit button becomes available. So that's one of the things that we can do there. We can also, if I go through and clear these real quick, and I know I could do a reset on them. And I can also, I put this on here, this was just for testing and demonstration purposes to say that we can reset this one-shot thing. So we'll reset that. We're kind of back to normal here. We've got our normal form. So we can see if a user puts in some information in here, and some information in here, some information in here, when they hit submit, everything goes as planned. There's no error or feedback because everything was put in properly. So that's another way to actually go through and to have users have their input validated, and restrict them from submitting, or give them a one shot and then give warnings as to what it is that needs to be filled in. So how do we do this? Well, one of the things here is that each one of these is actually working off of a toggle. Now the toggle is hidden. I've hidden it in this case only for the sake of saying this is something that we're going to expose right now. So I'm going to go ahead and go over here to our disable, and we have a toggle in here in this group, and I'm going to go ahead and turn this on for right now so that we can see it. So we'll make it visible just so you know that it's there. And just real quick, just to make sure that we see this, if I clear one of these out, my toggle goes to an invalid. It's that which the submit button works from. So if we look at the submit, we can see here in the display mode that we're looking to see if that toggle 1 value, which is either going to be a true or a false, if it's on, then it's true. And that means our submit button is in edit mode and we can select it. If it's false, then it's going to be disabled, which is what we see right here. So again, looking at this in play, we put some stuff in there, and now we have a valid form because we have information in all the places that are there. Now, some of the questions may come up, it's like, why didn't I put all of that into that disabled mode? I could have put in all my conditions to check to make sure my fields were valid and do all that other kind of stuff. You can do that. I personally tend to find that it's nicer to have a toggle on your screen somewhere that you can say, now this is just called toggle 1, but I would call this something like toggle form, we'll say form 1 because this is on the left side, form 1 is valid. And so this is a little bit more meaningful name now. And when I look at this, first of all, I see that my display mode says, okay, if the toggle form 1 is valid, then it's edit. If it's not, it's disabled. From a maintenance standpoint, being able to go back and look at this app later on and say, oh, you know what, we need to make this second one required as well. So we need to add that to the formula for making it valid. If someone else is picking up from where you left off and they don't know that you put that display mode, that you put all your logic in there in the display mode, then they might be a little confused. But if they look through this screen and they say, oh, this toggle form 1 is valid, that seems probably like where I would do my checking to make sure that my form 1 is valid. So I would go in here and I'd look at this and I'd say, well, let's take a look and see what our default property is, because that's what determines if it's going to be true or false. And we go through here and we see that very simply we're making sure that if text input 1 text is not blank and text input 1_2.text is not blank and 3 is not blank and 4 is not blank, then this toggle will be true. So that, because this whole statement will evaluate to being true. And in fact, if we highlight all this and look, we can see that our designer is telling us that yes, in fact, this is true. So we know that this toggle is going to be on, and we can use this in our form and making sure our submit button is enabled or disabled. So the nice thing about this is there's 0 variables that are used. There's no I got to get this variable, that variable, set this, set that. None of that kind of stuff is done here. The only thing we're doing is working from having a toggle that's either true or false based on the condition that we have, and we have a submit button that works off of the value of that toggle to determine if it should be enabled or disabled. So pretty basic stuff. Let's take a look though over here at our one shot. So in our one shot we actually introduce a variable into this. And we can see if we take a look, first of all, we notice that we have another toggle here. And for clarity, I'm going to name this toggle form2 is valid. And we'll go ahead and set that and change its name. And we'll go ahead and make it visible right now so that we can just see it so we know that it's there. And we take a look at the default, and we see the default property is exactly the same as the other one, except it is actually the text inputs for this other form. Sorry, I didn't actually rename them all. I just sort of went with the usual and copied and pasted and put them in there. You'd probably want to rename your text inputs with something that's more meaningful so that you know that they're actually those particular controls. Makes it much easier to read. So how does this one-shot deal work? All right, so what we take a look at now is our select action on our submit form. So we see here that we have if not toggle form 2 is valid, which is again our toggle, same thing we did in the other one, and one shot. Now this is a variable. So if we have a not valid form and we have not a one shot, which means we have not tried to submit before, then we set one shot to true. So that's all we're doing here is we're saying, okay, we've got this variable that we've called one shot. One shot only means that we've clicked on the submit button once. So initially, that's going to be false. So the first time that person hits on the submit, if this condition is met that the form is not valid and they've not clicked on submit before, then we're going to set the one shot to true. And now, if one shot is set to true, we've got some more things that go on here. Let's go ahead and take a look at this text input one right here. And specifically, you may remember that what we had was we had a border color that was different. So if we come up here and take a look at our border color, we can see that we say, okay, if one shot, which is going to be either true or false, and this particular field is blank, then it's going to be red. Otherwise, it's going to be the standard color, which is blue in this case. So we're saying if one shot, that means they've hit the submit button, and this particular field is blank, then it's going to be red. And the significance of that is, if we go through here, let's go ahead and take one of these out, and let's take this one out. If we hit the submit, we only want to highlight the fields that need to be filled in and put in the red borders around them. So that's why we look specifically at the different text boxes that we're on. So we want those text boxes to correspond to the ones that we're currently looking at. So if you kind of look through here, you'll see all the border colors are looking to see if the control that they're on is blank or not. And that way we can show that it's red, show it in red if it needs to be filled in. The only other thing that we had that sort of popped up here was we had this label. Very simple. It's a label. It just reads, please correct the highlighted fields. And we'll take a look and we see that the visible property, you guessed it, it's based on one shot and that toggle value. So we'll display that if one shot is true, meaning they've clicked on the submit button once, and the toggle form 2 is valid. So making sure that this is actually valid. So that's sort of how to do some basic validation on your fields of your custom input form. And it all works out pretty well. It's pretty easy to work with. There's not a lot of complexity that's involved, and you get some of the same basic concepts that you get within the edit form with the valid property. So that's one way that you can create with these toggles an indication of whether it's valid or not. So moving on to a little bit more complex situations. These were custom forms. So if we take a look now over here, we're going to take a look at this one, which is a little bit more complex form. So in this particular one, we have here we're asking for an email address to be put in. And then here's our sort of floater input, which is meaningless because it's not required. But here we're also asking for some number to be put in. And then in this one, we're asking for a part number that matches this pattern, which is letter, 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 dash, number, number, dash, letter, letter, letter. And we want that to be precise. And then we also want a date to be put in, and we want it to be some date that's after today's date. So these are the conditions. That's what we say has to make a valid form submission. a valid email, a valid number, a valid part number, and a date that's after today. So a little bit more complex. And I didn't bring the one shot over here. That works pretty much the same way. I kept it simple in this case, and we're just going to focus on the restrict submit, which is the meaning that we're not going to allow the submit button to be available until after somebody puts in all the information that goes in there. So real quick, to test it out, just to make sure it works, we'll do somebody at somewhere.com. And we're going to go down here and put in some number. We'll put in, I don't know, 23 sounds like a good number. And we'll go down here and put in a part number, and we'll say ABCD-12-XYZ. And then we're going to come down here. We're going to say we want a date after today, and that would be the 19th. And now we have a submit button. So all of that happened just sort of with the magic of this toggle down here. So let's take a look at that real quick. We didn't have to do anything special with our text inputs. These are all exactly the same from the previous screen. The only difference in here is I changed the labels on these to reflect more of what we were putting in. And I also changed the hint text of some of these just so it was a little bit more clear for this demonstration as to what it was that we were putting in. The real fun of this comes in on our toggle. So let's take a look at that toggle and see what's going on. Remember, the only thing we really deal with in this toggle is the default property. So let's go take a look there. And now, if we take a look through this, we see our formula looks a little bit different. I'm going to break this out line by line so you can see it a little bit better. And we have 4 different fields on our input form that we're checking to make sure are valid. So the first one is we're using a regular expression formula called isMatch. And isMatch is something that you can do general validations against to determine if your text actually matches a pattern. So in this one we're saying, okay, let's look at our text field in here, our text input 1_10, so wonderfully named, which happens to be this one where we have our email. And we're going to test that against a built-in email validator. So we don't have to go through putting in the regular expression to do all of the determination of what is a valid email. PowerApps has kind of included that for us, and they have the email operator that you can use here for this format, and it'll automatically do that comparison for you. So just by standing here at the end, we can see that this isMatch on that field for email is true, so it matches an email. If we were to come down here, let's just real quick for the fun of making something not work, if we were to get rid of that period in there, it's no longer a valid email. So let's go back here just to verify this. If we come back to our formula, take a look here, we put our cursor up here and we can see isMatch is false. So based on our logic, if we have a false and a true and a true and a true, we're going to have a false. All 4 have to be true in order for our default to evaluate the true. That's a good old Boolean logic, and always helpful to know when to use ands and ors. In this case, we're using ands. That means all of them have to be true in order for our value to be true. The next thing that we're looking at is we're using, again, another built-in function called isNumeric. So isNumeric will look at some text, in this case, the input of this over here, which is text input 1_14, and we're looking to see if that's numeric. And we put in a 2, 3, so we see that that comes to be true. If we were to change this to something else and maybe put in some letters, we would see that our validation now is false because that's no longer a number that's in there. Now the final piece of this, well, sort of the next piece of this I should say, is that we're looking at this part number. Now we don't have a built-in function for that. We have the isMatch, which will do regular expressions for us, and we have to kind of put together our own regular expression format here. And if you don't know regular expressions, it's okay because a lot of people don't. and they can get confusing, and yeah. If you know regular expressions, then go for it. You can use this all over the place. If you don't, check out some of the references on the internet. See how to build these up and how to use those. But I'll tell you what it boils down to in this case. We've got a couple different things that we're looking at. This little guy right here says that we're looking for any letter, whether it be small letter A through small letter Z or capital A to capital Z, and we're looking for 4 of them. Then we're specifically looking for a dash. Then we're looking for numbers 0 through 9, and we're looking for 2 of those, and then another dash, and then again our letters A through Z, both small and uppercase, and we're looking for 3 of those. Now you can use some of the built-in formats again in PowerApps and build these up as a string. I broke it all out this way just for demonstration purposes, so you can see what's really going on in here. And again, because of that, we look here and we see that our is match is true. If we were to come down here and change something, and let's say we put a letter in here, say A2, now this would no longer match. And if we look at our toggle again, we will see, putting our cursor here, we see that it is now false, that no longer matches. The final bit of this is our date. So here we have a date picker on the form, and we're just making sure that the selected date that's there is greater than today's date, which is now. So the date has to just be greater than today's. That's pretty straightforward. So if all 4 of those conditions are met, then our final default value will be true, and thus our toggle will be true, and thus, because our submit, the display mode is based off of the toggle value, that will be either on or off. And again, remember the reason that we put all this stuff out here is for clarity. So that we would say toggle, we'll say complex form is valid. So in this case, when the next person comes along and looks at your app and has to fix something, or even yourself, and believe me, you start doing a lot of apps, you'll forget what you did in one to the other. You can quickly see here that this toggle is what is all about. Sometimes, just as an FYI, important stuff, I will actually, in this case I have this in a group, but I'm going to take it out of the group and I'll just put it in its own little world up here. All I did was a cut and a paste. So when you do that, it takes it out of its grouping. So it's no longer part of this enable disable grouping here. It's now on its own. And what's important is it's here at the top. It's at the very top. Now remember, this is going to be hidden. We typically would hide this. We don't want the users to see it so much. But that is right at the top. When I come into this form and try to fix something because somebody says, you know what, our part numbers now have an additional 2 digits at the end, we need to make sure that's valid. I know immediately when I come in here, I say, okay, here's my validation. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to fix this by going into the default, and I'm going to say, oh, you've added 2, we got to put 2 numbers at the end. Okay, so I can say 0 through 9. And we're going to have 2 of those, and now the only other thing that we would want to do is change our label so that the user would understand that it needs to have 2 numbers at the end. So we come back here now and we see that, let's fix our stuff. We know this is now valid. We know that this is now valid. We fix this, and we know that we need to put in a 2 more digits in here. So we'll put in 3, and now our form is valid. So all of that happened just simply from that toggle. Nothing else was needed. Most importantly, and I see people get into this often, that they get into, okay, well, let's go, we have to set a variable in the OnChange and all these other things for all these fields. Way too complex. You don't need all that stuff. Unless you have a specific reason to set a variable once something is changed, just stay away from it. It just gets so confusing because then you're relying on that OnChange action to occur to set the variables. Variables are snapshots in time, and they're yours to manage. They're not going to change dynamically. This toggle will change dynamically. Whenever anything up here in these other fields change, that will all change with it. So I don't have to deal with following some action and trying to set variables and then trying to compare them later on. Very simple solution. Set up your fields, set up your validation toggle, and then do anything you want based off of that. So that's kind of it for complex forms. There's a million other ways that you could go with this stuff, and we could get into other types of input types. We could get into things like drop-down boxes, combo boxes, things like that. All of that is pretty much the same. In fact, we can do that right now just for the fun of it. We'll say that we're going to put in a drop-down box, and we'll go ahead and put in some samples here. And we're going to put in some samples to be, let's go ahead with, let's put in some of our own values here, and we'll say value, we'll start out with a blank one, and then we'll have a value of, oops, let's get this action here going. We'll say 1, and then we'll have another value here of 2. So we'll keep it simple. We'll do that. We also need to turn this into a table because we need to supply a table of records to a drop-down box. So that's what we've done here. We've set a table to this, and we've given it a table of 3 different records. One is blank, one is a value of 1, one is a value of 2. And if we want, we can go ahead and see that we actually have those values here. So we see there they are, blank, 1, and 2. And the one thing that we want to do in our match here, in our toggle, is we want to say, okay, and we'll say the drop down 1 dot selected dot value. We'll say it is not is blank. I should have started on that end. Sorry, but here's the idea. Not is blank drop down 1 selected dot value. So that's saying that drop down selected value should not be blank. So let's go ahead and go through here, and we see that we don't have a submit button. We've added this drop down in here, and we say, okay, it has to be something. We set it to 1, and now we have a submit button. So very easily we added new stuff into our complex form, and we didn't have to go through a lot of different areas to make sure that we were setting new variables and then figuring all the other stuff. All we did was we put our drop down in, and we went to our complex form validator, and we added that statement in there for making sure that that was not blank. So there you go. There's kind of an easy way to do custom validation of forms in your own way. You can get crafty about it. You can do a lot of different things. But definitely go at it, have some fun, and always welcome to see feedback and suggestions and comments and questions. So enjoy your new forms.